Before most Canadians even knew what the Canada Strong Fund was, people had already decided what it meant. Within minutes, the reactions were everywhere. Scam, liberal nonsense, sovereign wealth fund, government takeover, nation building, debt spiral. And the strange part is almost nobody was reacting to the same thing. Some people thought this was an investment fund. Some thought it was an industrial policy. Others thought it was borrowed money wrapped in patriotic branding. And still others thought it was Canada finally getting serious about building those things again, all before the details had even settled. And that's where we are now. Politics don't arrive in a calm environment anymore. They arrive in a storm of interpretation. And the space between what's actually being proposed and what people think is being proposed doesn't stay empty very long. On today's episode, we're going to slow this down. What exactly is the Canada Strong Fund? Why is the government describing it the way it is? Why are the reactions so immediate and so divided? And what does all of this say about how Canadians now process politics, economics, and leadership itself? I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and this is The Canadianist.
From the headlines to what's really going on underneath. This is The Canadianist. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Here's Chris.
Hello, friends, fellow Canadians. My name is Christopher M. Michaud. Welcome to the podcast. Today, this is The Canadianist. So this is one of those stories where the reaction actually got ahead of the information. Before I even had a chance to read into what this all was, I was seeing it everywhere, online, social media, the usual voices jumping in right away, and the range is exactly what you'd expect. Everything from this being some kind of scam to more of the same liberal thinking to just outright dismissal before anyone's even had a chance to look at the details. And that caught my attention. Not because the criticism is surprising, it isn't, but because of how fast it showed up. It was immediate. And at that point, I hadn't really read it yet, and I was thinking, all right, well, what is this thing actually? I got a chance to pull over, go through it properly, and what's being announced is something called the Canada Strong Fund, about $25 billion in initial capital, and the purpose, at least on paper, is to support large-scale projects across the country. Energy, infrastructure, critical minerals, manufacturing, the kinds of projects that tend to sit in the system for a long time, get talked about, studied, and then delayed, and sometimes never actually move. Now, where this starts to differ from what we usually hear is in how the government wants to be involved. This isn't just about funding things from the outside. The structure of this fund allows the federal government to take equity stakes in projects, to issue loans and guarantees, and to partner directly with private investors. So instead of just setting the rules and waiting, Ottawa is stepping in as a participant. That's a noticeable shift. Now, at the same time, the language around this is doing a lot of work. You're hearing it described as a sovereign wealth style fund, and in some cases, just straight up Canada's first sovereign wealth fund. That's where things start to get a little unclear. When people hear that term, they're not thinking about project financing. They're thinking about countries that have built up large pools of surplus wealth and are investing it over time. That's the image that comes with it. So right away, you've got two things happening at once. You've got what the fund appears to be structurally, which is a financing and investment tool for major projects. Then you've got how it's being described, which points people towards something that sounds much bigger and more established. Now, in terms of timing, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Globally, there's been a shift. The United States is backing its industries aggressively. Europe is doing the same. Governments are taking a more active role in shaping where investment goes and how projects move forward. Canada, fairly or not, has developed a reputation for being slower. Projects take time, approvals stretch out, financing becomes uncertain, and the gap between what gets announced and what actually gets built has become a familiar pattern. So the stated goal here is to close that gap, to move projects faster, to reduce risk, and to make sure Canada stays competitive in sectors that are increasingly tied to economic security. There's also a strategic layer to it. This isn't just about growth. It's about making sure key areas, energy, critical minerals, supply chains are not entirely dependent on outside forces in a more uncertain global environment. Now, one of the key elements in how this fund is supposed to work is the equity component. The government can actually take ownership positions in projects, which means it shares in potential returns if those projects succeed. But it also means it's taking more risk. There are also early indications that there could be some form of public participation down the line where Canadians might be able to invest in the fund directly, although that part hasn't been fully detailed yet. At the same time, as this is being rolled out, you're already seeing some of the criticism take shape. A lot of it focused on the broader fiscal picture. Canada is running deficits. There's a significant level of federal debt. So the question being raised is whether something like this is being built from a position of strength or whether it's ultimately supported by borrowing. There are also questions about how this fits into everything else that already exists. Canada has multiple programs and agencies aimed at supporting large projects. So does this simplify things, or does it just add another layer? And then there's the simplest question of all. Does it even work? The issue hasn't been identifying what needs to be built. The issue has been getting it built. So the real test for something like this isn't the announcement. It's whether projects actually move, whether timelines shorten, whether anything tangible comes out on the other side. And as of right now, a lot of the details around how this will operate, governance, selection, deployment, are still expected to come later. So where we are right now is this. A $25 billion fund has been announced. It's designed to put government capital directly into major Canadian projects. It represents a more active role for Ottawa in financing, and it's being described in a way that suggests something larger than just a project fund. That's what we're seeing. Okay, welcome back. Part 2 of the show. My name's Christopher and Michaud. This is the Canadianist, the podcast. So in the first half, we walked through what this actually is, at least as it's being presented. The Canada Strong Fund. About $25 billion designed to support major projects, government stepping in as an investor, not just as a regulator. Now, that's the surface. Let's get underneath it a bit because this is where the reaction starts to make more sense, but also where it starts to fall apart. The first issue here is clarity. And I think that's the real problem with this announcement so far. Not necessarily the idea itself, but how it's being explained, or maybe more accurately, how it's not being explained. You've got this fund that structurally looks like a project financing and investment tool. Government puts capital into projects, shares risk with private investors, tries to move things that might otherwise stall forward. That's one thing. But then you've got it being described as a sovereign wealth style fund. And those two things don't sit cleanly together. A sovereign wealth fund, in the way people understand it, is built from surplus. It's about preserving wealth, investing it over time, managing it for future generations. That's not what this is. And that doesn't automatically make it bad, but it does create confusion. Now people are reacting to the label instead of the structure. That's exactly what you see online. People jumping in right away, calling it a scam, calling it reckless, calling it more of the same without really separating what's actually being proposed from how it's being framed. Now, to be fair, some of what that reaction is predictable. That's just where we are right now. But some of it is being fueled by the lack of clarity coming from the government itself. If you're going to use language that carries that kind of weight, you have to be very clear about what you mean by it. Otherwise, people start filling in the gaps themselves. And when they do that, you end up with a conversation that's not really about policy anymore. It's about competing interpretations of what it is. Now, step back from the language for a second and look at the idea on its own. The idea is that the government is going to take capital, put it into major projects, share the risk, and try to accelerate things that aren't moving fast enough. In the current global environment, that's not a crazy idea. The United States is doing it. Europe is doing it. Governments are stepping in much more directly to shape economic outcomes. So the instinct here is understandable. The question isn't really whether the government should be more active. The question is whether it can actually execute something like this effectively. And that's where Canada has struggled, not in identifying priorities. We know what matters: energy, infrastructure, minerals, manufacturing. We've been talking about these things for years. Where we struggle is getting from plan to reality. Approvals take time. Coordination between levels of government is complicated. Projects lose momentum. And that's not something a fund on its own automatically fixes. Now, layer in the other part of the criticism, which is where the money is coming from. You're hearing the argument that this is being built in a deficit environment, that it's effectively supported by borrowing. And there's truth in that. But again, it's not the full story. Governments borrow to invest all the time. That's not new. The real question is what you get on the other side of that investment. I think part of the skepticism people are feeling comes from something a lot more personal and familiar than economics. Most people have experienced some version of this before in their own lives. Your boss calls a meeting, big smile, big announcement. We've got a new compensation structure, everyone. We found a better system. You're going to love it. And then the pat on the back with the shit-eating grin. And almost instinctively, everyone in the room already knows what's coming. It usually means the money is still coming from you somehow. It's just being rearranged, repackaged, or explained differently. And I think for a lot of Canadians, that's the emotional reaction this kind of announcement triggers immediately. Not necessarily because the idea itself is automatically bad, but because people have become conditioned to hear complicated financial language as a softer way of describing risk being pushed back onto them. So when they hear phrases like sovereign wealth fund or public participation, strategic investment, leveraged capital, a lot of people aren't hearing opportunity first. They're hearing, all right, where's the catch? Are you creating something that generates return, that builds capacity, that strengthens the economy, or are you just adding another layer of spending without clear outcomes? And that's the line this fund is going to be judged on. It's also where the skepticism comes from, and Canadians have seen this before. Not this exact structure, but the pattern, announcement, big intentions, and then a long stretch of where it's not entirely clear on what's actually happening. So when you look at the reaction, even the exaggerated reaction, there's something underneath it. There's a lack of trust that this will translate into real, visible results. And that's not something you fix with branding. You fix it with execution. So when you step back and look at this whole thing, the issue isn't whether this is a sovereign wealth fund or not. It isn't. But that's not the point. The point is that Canada is trying to shift toward a more active role in its economy, putting capital directly into projects and trying to compete in a much more aggressive global environment. That's the real move here. The problem is that move is being communicated in a way that's not landing. And when it doesn't land, people fill in the blanks and the conversation goes sideways. So the real question coming out of all of this isn't, is this good or bad? It's much simpler than that. Can Canada take something like this and actually turn it into projects that get built? At this stage, that's where the credibility gap is, not in the idea, but in the follow-through. Welcome back, everyone. Segment 3 of the show. I am Christopher M. Michaud. This is the Canadianist podcast. All right, so let's shift gears, but stay right in the same lane. What's happening around this fund isn't only about the policy itself. It's also about how quickly reaction forms now and how little time there is between something being announced and people deciding what it is. And you saw it with this one. Before most people had even read into what the Canada Strong Fund actually is, the reaction was already there. Strong opinions, strong language, very confident takes, and not a lot of patience for detail. And if you think about it, it's not that surprising anymore. That's just how things move now. Something gets announced, and within minutes, it's framed, not explained, framed. It gets dropped into a category, good or bad, smart or reckless, helpful or harmful. There's almost no pause between information and judgment. And once that judgment sets in, it's very hard to pull people back from it. You see it all the time. People reacting to headlines without reading the article, reacting to clips without context, reacting to other people reacting. By the time the actual details start to circulate, it's almost too late. The narrative is already in place. Now, layer something else on top of that. On the international stage, Prime Minister Mark Carney is being received in a very different way. You're seeing him show up on lists like Time's most influential figures. You're seeing positive reception in Europe, particularly in economic and policy circles. That's not surprising given his background, central banking, global finance. Those worlds already know who he is. So externally, there's a level of credibility that's very clear. He fits that environment, speaks their language, and operates comfortably at that level. Now bring it back home. The reaction here doesn't match that. It's not even the same tone. It's not the same reception. It's not even the same level of understanding of what's being done. Here, it's more muted, more uncertain, and in a lot of cases, it turns negative very quickly. Not after analysis, right away. And that gap is important, not because one side is right and the other side is wrong, but because it tells you something about how things are being received. So now you have a government introducing more complex, more strategic economic tools, things that require a bit of explanation, a bit of context, a bit of patience. And at the same time, you have an environment that doesn't reward patience. It rewards speed, it rewards certainty, and strong opinions delivered very quickly. That's a tough combination, because if something isn't immediately clear, it doesn't stay neutral. It gets filled in. People don't sit there and say, I don't know yet. They reach for whatever explanation is the closest, whatever voice they already trust, whatever narrative fits what they already believe. And that becomes the interpretation. Now you're not dealing with one understanding of a policy. You're dealing with 10 different versions of it, all forming at the same time. Some based on fact, some based on assumption, others based on pure reaction. And all of them are competing with each other. That's the environment this fund landed in. And it's the same environment every policy lands in now. So when you look at the reaction, it's not just about whether people like it or don't like it. It's about how quickly that reaction locked in before the information had time to settle. And that is what we're seeing. Okay, welcome back. Next segment of the podcast. I am Christopher M. Michaud. This is the Canadianist. Let's take the environment we were talking about from the last segment and then take the policy itself and put them both together. You start to see where the real issue is. It isn't about whether people agree or disagree with the Canada Strong Fund. It's about whether the system around it can support a clear understanding of what it is. That is where things start to break down. On one side, you have leadership trying to operate at a fairly high level. Complex policy, long-term positioning, global competitiveness, all of that. And to be fair, that matters. Canada doesn't exist in isolation. What's happening globally matters. How the country positions itself matters. You want competence there. You want someone who understands those systems. By most accounts, on that front, there's credibility. The background is there. The recognition internationally is there. The ability to operate in that space is there. But that's only part of the job. Leadership at home is something completely different. It's not only about what you're doing. It's about whether people understand what you're doing. It's about whether they feel connected to it. It's about whether it makes sense in their day-to-day reality. And that is where the gap starts to show. If something is technically sound but not clearly communicated, it doesn't land as competence. It lands as confusion. And confusion doesn't stay neutral for very long. It turns into skepticism. Then it turns into rejection. Look at the other side of the political spectrum. Different problem, same outcome. The message doesn't evolve. The tone doesn't shift. The approach stays the same, even when the results don't change. There's an assumption there that volume solves the problem. Say it louder. Say it more often. Repeat it until it sticks. What you're seeing is that it doesn't. It just reinforces the divide. Now you've got two different failures happening at the same time. One side isn't cutting through clearly enough, the other side isn't adjusting at all. In the middle of that, the public conversation starts to collapse, not all at once, but gradually. It becomes less about understanding and more about reaction, less about substance and more about positioning. People aren't engaging with the same information anymore. They're engaging with different versions of it, filtered, interpreted, sometimes distorted before it even reaches them. So when something like the Canada Strong Fund gets introduced, it doesn't enter a shared space of understanding. It enters a fragmented one. And that's the real issue underneath all of this. Not the idea itself, not even the reaction on its own. It's the disconnect between what's being done, how it's being explained, and how it's being received. That gap is where everything starts to break down. Once that gap gets wide enough, it becomes very difficult to close. All right, let's bring all this together. Welcome back to the last segment of the show today. My name's Christopher M. Michaud. This is the Canadianist, the podcast. So let's bring all this together. There's a pattern running through everything we talked about today, and it goes beyond any one story. A policy gets introduced. It's complex. It takes some explanation. It's trying to respond to changes that are happening globally as much as domestically. The reaction starts almost immediately. People form opinions quickly, strong ones, confident ones, often before the full picture is even on the table. So now there's a gap. What's being done sits in one place, and what people think is being done sits somewhere else. That space in between doesn't stay empty for very long. It gets filled. That's where all the noise comes in. That's where the commentary comes in. That's where the people who are reacting first and thinking later find their footing. And once that space is filled, it's very hard to clear it out. Now let's look at the leadership side. We have a prime minister who operates comfortably in global circles. The experience is there. The recognition is there. Internationally, that part looks solid. At home, though, it feels very different. Clarity isn't cutting through the same way. The translation from policy to everyday understanding isn't landing the way it needs to. So instead of people saying, all right, I see what this is, they hesitate. They question it. And that hesitation turns into reaction. Now bring in the other side. There's frustration there, real frustration. The approach doesn't shift. The message stays the same. The assumption seems to be that repeating it more forcefully will change the result. It doesn't. Now, both sides are feeding the same environment from different directions. One side isn't cutting through clearly enough. The other side isn't offering anything new. And in the middle, people are trying to make sense of it in real time. The conversation starts to break down. It turns into noise. People talk past each other instead of working through what's actually being proposed. And at that point, it's not about one fund or an announcement or anything like that anymore. It's about how we're functioning, how decisions are explained, how people understand or don't understand what they're hearing. It's not that nothing is happening. There are decisions being made and there are policies being put forward. People don't feel like they understand them. And when that gap opens up, it gets filled fast, not with clarity, with reaction. When you look at something like the Canada Strong Fund, the real question isn't only whether it works. The question is about whether we're still able to have a conversation about it that leads somewhere, whether there's enough clarity to understand before reacting, whether leadership can bring people along instead of leaving them to fill in the blanks. The political conversation can move past repetition and start making this thing make sense, and without that, even a strong idea struggles to land. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As we move forward, we're going to start expanding the show, more topics, more depth, and more engagement. And once the studio is ready, we'll be moving into a new space and bringing video into the mix as well. There's a lot coming, and I'm looking forward to building this out with you. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and I'm a Canadianist. And if this resonates with you, I invite you to continue the conversation at thecanadianist.news. And to find out more about the United Canadian Centrists and our vision for Canada's future, visit uccparty.ca. See you next time.
You've been listening to The Canadianist. New episodes daily. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Subscribe and stay connected. The Canadianist.